for having, we got talking on an airplane, you know how that is. And when I discovered she was a philosophy student, I told her I was a philosophy professor, and one thing led to another, and I told her what my research was. So she's the one that brought my research to the department's attention. And it's a very nice kind of coincidence when something like that happens. So thank you very much, Karen. I brought these beautiful flowers today. What I'd like to do is, I have a paper, but I'll also just present and talk through it, and then so we can have quite a bit of time to discuss together. I've given out a sheet to you which will help, in some sense, organize all the material that I'm going to give you. It has on the first page a chart of structures which I'll explain as we go through my main hypotheses, and then on the second and third pages it has the dates of who the philosophers I consider significant in the history of philosophy of gender issues, looking at it from the concept of women, but always also looking at the relation between woman and man in that. And so this will be just sort of a key that you can kind of look at. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I was a professor of philosophy at Concordia University of Montreal for 30 years. I retired, and then my Superior General sent me here to Denver to open up a philosophy department for seminarians that want to become Catholic priests in 1996. And so I set up the department, and now someone else, fortunately, is chairing it after 5 years, and I'm enjoying being able to go back to research. And I've been given a sabbatical for next year, because this is actually my next year will be my 8th year, and I'll be writing the 3rd and final volume of this. I won't live any longer than that. So, but what I'm going to share with you is kind of the fruit of this research of almost 35 years, I would say. I started in 1969, if you can imagine, doing this work, not realizing how important it was going to get. I mean, I just, as a young professor, you try to find an article you can write that somebody will publish. And I just started off by noticing there was a certain similarity in Aristotle and Kierkegaard's concept of woman, but a very great difference in their concept of man. So that was my first little article, and it got published right away. You know, little things like that. And I thought, well, let's now look at Nietzsche. How is Nietzsche compared to Kierkegaard? So I did a little article on Nietzsche, and it got published right away. So I thought, I'm onto something here. And then in Canada, there's very great, generous grants that are given by the Canadian government, Social Science and Humanities Research Council. So at a certain point, I decided to apply for sabbatical and go, I thought, to the Library of Congress and take 1 year and write the whole history in 1 year. Now, part of the reason I naively thought that was we never studied anything on gender in graduate school. It wasn't considered philosophically significant. And so I had no idea how much material there was out there. So I got the sabbatical. I went to the Library of Congress, and by the time October came, I realized there was no way. It took me 2 years to get up to 1250, and that's the first volume. And so, but then the Canada Council, they realized the fruit of what I was doing, and so they kept giving me funding for all those years. So it enabled me to travel to Washington, London, Paris, get research assistants, translators, and so on. So I have the research done really for the contemporary part, modern contemporary, but I never had a chance to write it because I've always taught full time. So unless I have a sabbatical or some major period of time, I can't do it. But I've thought about it, and I've organized the thinking about it, and I've given papers pretty much continuously in modern and contemporary. With my doctorate, I wrote it on P.F. Strawson's individuals, metaphysics, and looking at the person, basically, in Strawson's work. And so I've always been interested in the modern and contemporary period, even though I went back and started here. So what I'd like to do then is to sort of sketch out for you a schema in terms of how I understand how the history of philosophy approaches the question of man and woman's identity. What are the options? There are 3 basic theories you'll see, and I prefer what is called integral gender complementarity, which is the one at the bottom, and I'll give you reasons for why I do that. But it's important for you to see it's been a very significant issue in philosophy from the beginning, starting with the pre-Socratics. So in this first volume, I looked at how almost all the fundamental questions about gender identity were raised by the pre-Socratics. And yet they didn't develop a systematic answer to the questions. At least we don't have we don't have any knowledge, we only have fragments. Where we began to get a systematic answer was with Plato. Plato was the first one to develop a systematic answer to the woman-man question, and he did it across the 4 categories that the pre-Socratics had raised. Those categories are, the first one is in the area of metaphysics. Are male and female the same or different? That's a simple question. They're the same. The second category is what I call the category of generation. Does what the mother and the father give to generation have any significance for gender identity or not? Second question. Third is what I call the area of wisdom. So, simply stated, are men and women wise in the same way or different ways by knowing the same kind of things or different things? Do they have the same faculties or not? Those are the questions. Then the fourth area is in the question I just call virtue. Are men and women good in the same way by doing the same things or not? So those were the 4 categories that the pre-Socratics raised questions in. So Plato was the one to give the first basically systematic answer in what we call unisex or gender unity. He argued that yes, men and women have equal dignity, and there are no significant differences between them, although those of you that know Plato well know that he says woman is weaker, and in the Republic and the laws there's a little bit longer time for her to learn what she has to learn wise. But in essence, there's no significant difference because the soul is sexless. And if you believe his myths have a metaphysical dimension, it's born in male or female bodies, or animals even. So that Plato is what I call the founder of the unisex position, with some variation. Then Aristotle is whom I call the founder of the traditional gender polarity position, which basically he answers systematically across all 4 questions that there are significant differences between men and women, philosophically significant differences, and that the male is by nature superior to the female. And again, if you want, we can go into any of the qualities of his answer, but he really argued very, very systematically all the way across. He also, though, had, I think, the better position on the person than Plato did. That is, he argued the person is a unity of soul and body. So you have this irony that Plato had a dualism, and yet he had equality, and Aristotle had what we call hylomorphism, which is a unity of soul and body, and yet he argued female was by nature inferior. And those were basically the first 2 positions, the founders of unisex and polarity positions, that established the framework in the history of philosophy for the discussion of gender. That's what I call the sort of the background. You have philosophers following them, but you don't have anything new happening until you get to Augustine and the City of God. And if you look at your dates, you can see that's quite a long time away. So the stage is set. Various philosophers, the Neoplatonists follow Platonic view mostly. And what I did in my text is I have all the texts for these positions and all the philosophers, what they said and how they said it. But what I'm going to look at today are what I call the moments of inspiration, where you begin to have someone saying, what we really want to have is a theory where we can understand man and woman as having equal dignity and worth, but also as being significantly different. That's the question. And the first one to pose this possibility is Augustine. And believe it or not, he does it in the City of God. And here's a quote, I'll just read you from him. He knows the Aristotelian tradition and he knows the Platonic tradition, although he didn't know Greek very well, but he knew the traditions. He says, there are some who think that in the resurrection of the body, all will be men, and that women will lose their sex. Now you can see why that would follow Aristotle's view. If it's an imperfection of nature to be a woman, then in the resurrection all imperfections are removed by faith. This is a faith premise. Therefore, women should become perfect, i.e. men. Here's what Augustine says, for myself, I think that those others are more sensible who have no doubt that both sexes will remain in the resurrection. In the resurrection, the blemishes of the body will be gone, but the nature of the body will remain, and certainly woman's sex is her nature and no blemish. So Augustine sort of starts off with this theological insight. He's not able to carry it through all his philosophy, and again, all the arguments are in there, but just briefly, he also had Platonic elements in his thought, and he argued that women who are nuns, for example, lose their sex. They become like men, so you can see sort of a unisex model appearing there. And women who marry basically do not, he used this expression unfortunately, do not contain within themselves the image of God by themselves. They have to be with their husband in order to do it. So sometimes you'll see feminists just taking one little section or another of Augustine and say, not in God's image, that's woman for Augustine. Well, it's only part of the story. And what I tried to do in my research is look at the whole philosopher. What is his whole theory? And in the case of Augustine, it wasn't consistent, but it was a breakthrough. It was a movement towards something new. And I think we know in our own experience sometimes we aren't consistent, but we're actually moving towards something new. We can't quite get to that consistency yet. So that was the first moment then. The second moment of inspiration came with the Benedictine monastic tradition with Hildegard of Bingen. St. Anselm also had some parts in this, and those of you may or may not know, St. Anselm's famous for his ontological argument, but he wrote an incredible prayer to St. Paul in which he basically talked about St. Paul being his mother. Now, what he meant by this was that St. Paul was giving birth to him, helping him break through some terrible suffering that he had. But he was doing analogical thinking. He was beginning to look at this. And he didn't mean St. Paul was becoming a woman, but he was acting like a mother. So he was opening that up as this notion. And he said, Jesus Christ also acts like my mother in some ways. Not that he's female or a woman, but he acts like a mother. And Julian of Norwich, if you're familiar with her mystical literature, really, we think, drew her theory of that from Anselm. But where the philosopher who did the most is St. Hildegard of, not Saint, she's Hildegard of Bingen, she's not officially saint. She was a nurse, a physician in the monastery, and what she tried to do, quite interestingly, was to establish a theory of humors and elements to argue that women and men are equal in dignity and worth, but significantly different. And she had, for example, in the Aristotelian schema, the elements of fire and air were higher than water and earth, and the male was identified more with the elements of fire and air, and female more with water and earth. What Hildegard said is, no, the male is the lowest and the highest, earth and fire, and the female are the two middle ones, air and water. And therefore there's a lovely balance between them. You could see, I mean, we wouldn't accept her medieval science, but you could see what she's trying to do is to bring the balance back. And she also developed a very interesting typology of 4 types of men and 4 types of women, depending on the humors and elements. And she looked at how they interact with one another in marriage and how they live celibate life. And so she argued that in both cases it's the second type that has both of these elements of air, fire, and water in balance that are the best types of married husbands and wife and the best types of nuns and monks. It's a wonderful schema. So what's interesting about her then is that she began to try to find some schema to do it. It's limited in how she did it and so on. But that's around 1000. Again, if you're looking at your dates, we've jumped 600 years from Augustine. Okay? And so you do have some other, St. John Erigena follows the Neoplatonic view and argues that sex is a fall from the perfect unisex male. And then you have the infusion of Aristotelian arguments into the West through, first of all, Islamic philosophers, then Maimonides, and then St. Albert the Great read Maimonides, he got him, and then he transmitted them to St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, St. Albert the Great was a scientist, and he basically reasserted strongly all of Aristotle's arguments for the natural inferiority of women, with one exception. He introduced a new concept, that is, I don't want to go too much into detail here, but the Aristotelian theory was that if a female is generated, it's a derivation from the perfect type, because they thought there was one seed that somehow either it was received well or not well by the mother, the matter. The male provided the active seed result. And so what Aristotle concluded then is that a female that looks like the father is a bit of a derivation of type, or a male that looks like the mother is a bit of a derivation of it. A female that looks like the mother is even more a derivation from type. And so the question that St. Albert posed was, well, how can God, who creates nature, do this. I mean, there must be some way in which he intends females. They're half of the race. And so he came up with this principle that nature universally intends half of the generations to be female. But in any individual case, the seed that becomes a female is a derivation from type. So it's a polarity theory, that the female is by nature less than male. But by grace, then what they do is Christians, they introduce a compensatory theory. By grace, the female can be higher. You have the Virgin Mary, for example, as the prime example, and then many others. So St. Thomas then tried to, in a way, mitigate Albert's rather extreme Aristotelianism. And St. Thomas is wedged between Giles of Rome, who was his student. Albert was his teacher. Giles of Rome reasserted again the very rigorous Aristotelian principle. So if you look at Thomas Aquinas, he's in the middle, trying in a way to balance it to some extent. I'll give you another example. Aristotle had argued that the wife is an unequal friend of the husband, if you know in the Ethics. So because she's by nature inferior, so she should balance it out by giving him more reverence than he does her, and so on. There's a way of trying to do it. But St. Thomas argues, no, the husband and wife have the greatest equal friendship. So you can see him seeking some way, but he doesn't quite make it all the way. But that's, in Dante's Divine Comedy, Dante was very influenced by Thomas Aquinas. You see him through the figure of Beatrice, who is a philosophical figure. She argues with him all the way through Purgatory, reasons with him. He imagines her as having a higher level of relationship in terms of wisdom. And if you're familiar with Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, in the same way, he projects this imaginary lady philosophy who is more intelligent. And that kind of tries to mitigate a little bit the polarity that you find in so many of the others. Well, when is the next moment that you get complementarity? It occurs in the Renaissance. I'm scooting right along here very quickly. But it occurs in the Renaissance with Christine de Pizan. You can see I have Boccaccio and there's some others. We can talk about individual authors if you like. But the second volume, then, for me, starts at this period of 1250, just before the Renaissance. What I found myself absolutely fascinated. We'd never really studied the Renaissance in philosophy when I went to graduate school, and I just couldn't get over how rich it was. Dialogue between male and female philosophers started to occur. All kinds of correspondence, ways of setting up alternate schools to the universities. The university had been founded in Paris primarily for clerics. And so you had this situation where women had been able to get educated in the monasteries, upper-class women like Hildegard. No longer, all of a sudden, the universities were just for men. In the cities, they were for the mendicant orders, Dominicans, Franciscans, parish priests. But women were not invited to attend. And I truly don't believe it was a hostile act against women. I think it was a separate argument going on between the bishops in the cities and the abbots and the abbesses, really wanting to educate the priests who were not educated. And in fact, they were founded by women. Blanche of Castile founded the University of Paris, so you can't say it was a setup. But the unfortunate effect is that women truly lost out on major education until the 20th century, systematically. So philosophy is really nourished by a good education. So it meant a very different situation. Now, Christine de Pizan is very interesting because her father was a physician. She was born in Italy, but her father was a physician to the King of France. And so she went to Paris, where she was able to work privately in the Sorbonne Library. Jean Gerson was the rector. You may be familiar with him, his name. He writes things in spiritual writings. But anyway, he and the librarian allowed her to work there. She had her own little spot. So she became quite well educated. She married a French humanist, and she had 3 children. And all of a sudden, her father died, her husband died, and the king died. And she was in terrible straits. She had to support these 3 children, plus she had some women relatives. So she had a gift of writing, and so she began to write books. She actually wrote 41 books. And she's the first person, I have a whole chapter on her in the second book. Again, I couldn't believe what she did. She translated St. Thomas's first book of commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics from Latin into French. She used things from Boccaccio's famous Women into French. So she earned her living by translating, illustrating, and writing. Now she realized that something else had happened in the early medieval period, which was a whole slew of satires against women were promulgated by hand, and it'd be a bit like our sitcoms on television. I mean, they were just passed all around the place, very popular. They, however, unfortunately, integrated Aristotle's arguments to devalue women. And so she was infuriated. They also devalued marriage, and she loved being married. She was very happily married until she became a widow. So what she did then was write two major texts in which she took on directly these arguments using logic, very good logical form, Aristotle's logic, to defeat the satirists against women. So she becomes the next one, and she's very much a person interested in complementarity, and she describes her own theory, and she argues very well for it. You also then have a whole slew of other humanists beginning to defend women. They start setting up small schools nearby the universities. So you have them in Florence and Venice. You have them springing up all over the place. Leonardo Bruni began to write how women should be educated. Francesco Barbaro wrote a book on marriage. Cardinal Cusa, Nicholas Cusa, wrote a very interesting metaphysical text on masculine and femininity. You know, you can see they're beginning to probe how male and female are alike and how they're unlike. Some, though, basically reaffirmed the Aristotelian position, like Alberti. There was a German one, Albrecht von Ibe, an attorney who began to defend women's marriage laws. Then you have another woman called Asata Nogarola, who wrote, in complement with a man humanist, a dialogue about whether Adam or Eve had the greatest responsibility for sin. But she used Aristotle. She said if woman is by nature inferior, then her responsibility is less. You can't hold her to blame. And if she's equal, then you can hold, you know, it was a clever, clever dialogue. Okay? Then at that point, you begin to have a new development. A German humanist called Agrippa wrote a text on the superiority of woman over man. He argued, well, we know from Scripture, he was a theologian and a philosopher, woman was the last in creation. And we know God kept moving from fishes to, you know, human beings. So woman has to be superior. Plus, that she was made from the refined bone of man, and man was just made from mud. And, you know, all these arguments. You can argue either way with using those things. But he argued, we know that woman is superior. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it was just trying to balance the imbalance. This is what you see happening in the whole history of philosophy. This is what goes on. Whereas the proper thing is right in the middle. It's right there in front of their eyes, but they don't see it yet. So it takes until our century before you get the foundation. I've got a bit more time here. I can get you up to there. So there's a woman philosopher, though, Lucrezia Marinelli, who wrote an extraordinarily interesting, several hundred-page systematic argument against Aristotle called The Nobility and Excellence of Woman. And in this, she argued women's virtues are better than men's virtues, and men's vices are worse than women's vices. But she uses Aristotle's ethics all the way through it. Marsilio Ficino, who founded the Florentine Platonic Academy, you begin at this point in the later 1400s, early 1500s, to get Plato's arguments flooded into Italy. They weren't there before, but you have the Muslims invading Byzantine Greece and that whole area, and all these scholars fleeing to Italy and bringing with them all their Greek manuscripts and the ability to teach Greek. So all of these humanists started to learn the Greek language and to study Plato. So then many of them start using Plato to argue for an equality of men and women. But they're somewhat embarrassed about Plato's community of women, for example, and communal marriage. And so actually in some of the early translations, they just left them right out, those sections, or else they changed what Plato said. It wasn't until Ficino himself actually did the translation that you get an accurate translation of the Republic, the Laws, all the works of Plato, all the works of Plotinus. You also have at this point the invention of the printing press. It's starting right around the time of the Reformation. So these, the printing press in Venice, they're the humanists that are doing it, so they print Greek, Latin, and Italian, French texts. All of a sudden, they start becoming accessible to a broader audience. And so a lot of things are happening there. A sip of water here. Well, right at this point, then, we're poised right before modern philosophy. And Descartes then provides, unknowingly perhaps, a radical new metaphysical foundation for the unisex position. You know Descartes well, you're philosophy students, so you know that what he argued is that I am nothing but my mind, in a way, that thinks, that wills, that chooses, and it is a substance entirely separate from my body. They do interact, but I don't quite know how, and so on in the meditations. Now, Descartes himself did not directly talk about gender. The mind is unisex for Descartes. There's no male or female. In fact, I was shocked at the Library of Congress. He wrote a book on the formation of the fetus, and I looked at it thinking, here, I'm going to find something interesting. And all it talked about was physics and how certain angles and forces would determine whether the baby was female or male. You can so, as we say, Descartes emptied matter totally out of its organic reality. It's it's extended substance, all right? He's very consistent. But what happened there, the Protestant Reformation occurred at the same time, and many Protestant philosophers found in Descartes a rationale for rejecting the Catholic Church's history, because basically history and custom in any respect was able to be rejected. Because what had to happen was the truth was in the here and now, whatever I know clearly and distinctly, not tradition and so on. They also found in Descartes very good rationale for supporting the absolute equality of men and women. One of his most well-known disciples, a man named Francois Poulain de la Barre, wrote a huge book called The Equality of Two Sexes. He gave many arguments for the mental, physical, and moral equality of men and women. He said, while the body had certain sex differences related to reproduction, the spirit, brain, and faculties were the same in women and men, and they're equally capable of the same thing. And so these Protestant philosophers began to argue against women's not having access to education initially. Mary Estelle, a Protestant in England, wrote a book called A Serious Proposal to the Ladies, in which she wanted to set up a school for women's higher education. However, they should not be married. You begin to see, unfortunately, in England and in Protestant view, that you have to choose either to be a married person or to get a higher education. It seemed to be in total conflict with one another. And so an essay in defense of the female sex and some reflections on marriage, she basically used Descartes. She wanted the Cartesian method to be the foundation for her school. Unfortunately, the other thing that happened in her book on reflections on marriage, if any of you are interested in postmodernism, there's a huge book, this thick, by John D. Lee at Houston on the history of semiotics and sign. This is a fascinating thing that happened. Sadly, I think it had a negative effect for women ultimately. But initially it looked positive. In medieval philosophy, there was a notion of marriage as being a sign of a higher reality. For those of you that know theology, you'll know what I mean. Of God's wedding to the world, or Christ to the church, is said. And so a married couple the couple themselves are living signs of this relation of God to the world, Christ, and the church. And so there are three factors. There's the person looking at the married couple, there's the couple themselves, and then there's the reality, heavenly reality. Now what happened in England is, after Descartes really came to think that knowledge was of ideas in the mind rather than of reality. In other words, the object of what you know is an idea. And Locke followed this. And so in Locke and in England, you began to get what we call just a dyadic notion of sign. The sign simply represents something in your mind. Okay? Now, what the effect this had on marriage is, if you read the text describing marriage, we find them just simply describing marriage as it is. That's all marriage is. And so, for example, Mary Estelle says, before a man gets married, he only asks utilitarian questions about a prospective wife. What will she bring? How many acres? How much ready coin? Marriage is likened to servanthood, enslavement, natural subjection, and heaven then is simply a reward for having been through such torture on earth. It's terrible. What happened in England was if a woman married, she lost all her inheritance. It became only her husband's, or anything she brought into the marriage financially. So she really was legally put into a state. We could go into the details of this. But you can see the part of the difficulty then is it becomes an either-or situation in England. Now, in France, the opposite thing happens. You have, you begin to have some complementarity emerging actually in priests and nuns working together to take care of the poor. You have a huge number of them, friendships emerging. Starts in Spain, St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. In France, it's St. Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac. You have St. Francis de Sales and St. Jean de Chantal. And then in Quebec, where I lived all those years, it starts in 1600, 1639. In Quebec City, you have the same thing. You have the Ursuline Marie de Carnation and the Jesuit martyrs. You have all these Catholic men and women working together in very dynamic ways, in celibate relations. You also, though, Montreal was founded by married couples only. They considered themselves the new Israelites, starting a new world in the new world. So you have these things happening out there where people are actually living in relations of complementarity, but it hasn't yet influenced the philosophy, all right? But the world is changing. You didn't have that before. Well, by the end of the 18th century, you do have a philosopher, Marie-Jean-Antoine Marquis de Condorcet, who actually lived in New Haven, who wrote an article based on Descartes' views, saying that women ought to have equal right to vote as men. It's not just education now, it's the right to participate in society. And he used Cartesian arguments. If they're the same beings, they should have the same rights. And so then, at this point, it's right before the French Revolution, and so many, as you know, if you know your history, that many women were involved in that revolution. One famous one is a woman named Marie Gouze, who wrote a Declaration of Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, in which she begged for women's rights to vote in the Constitution. Well, the revolution occurred, the Constitution was written, and women didn't have the vote to write. She was guillotined in addition. And apparently Condorcet was either starved or murdered in prison, so things were pretty difficult out there in those days. But you have these issues now of the equality of men and women moving more and more into the theoretical and reflective part of culture. So you have Mary Wollstonecraft, a Cartesian feminist, wrote a book called An Historical and Moral View of the Origin and Progress of the French Revolution and the Effect It's Produced in Europe. She directly attacked Rousseau. Rousseau represents the French version of the male-female relationship, and his view was what I call a fractional complementarity, and this really sprang out of the Cartesian metaphysics. And my hypothesis is the reason it sprang out of it is you've gotten rid of the body in some way, and you don't have a foundation for an integral complementarity, which I'll explain later. And so what happens is you begin to find with Rousseau, well, man is reason, woman is intuition. Man is strength, woman's gentleness. You know, together the two make up one being. But neither one is a full person in any way whatsoever. And so this starts to become a big problem. And Emile, he describes this: woman is created for man's delight. The woman is the eye, the man is the hand, but the two are so dependent upon the one another that the man teaches the woman what to see and she teaches him what to do. Well, here's what Wollstonecraft was a rather unhappy woman, brilliant, but unhappy, and she lays into Rousseau. She says, now, how is this going to work in children? How indeed can she even bring up children? She can't educate her own children. How could she, where her husband is not always at hand to lend her his reason? When they both together make up one moral being, a blind will, eyes without hands would go a very little way. I mean, you can sort of see instinctively she knows there's something crazy about this position. But unfortunately, Rousseau is not the only one to present it. Immanuel Kant argued in his, it's a pre-critical work, but it's his essays on the beautiful and sublime, that a woman's philosophy is not to reason but to sense. And in What is Enlightenment, his essay, he says the entire fair sex does not have the courage to use their reason without direction from others. He also can't reduce marriage to a private contract between a man and a woman. That's all it was for him. And again, this has totally lost any sign value of anything greater than the marriage itself. Now, what's most surprising is Kant's closest friend, Theodor Gottlieb von Hippel, who was the mayor of Königsberg, wrote a rather major work called On Improving the Status of Women, in which he argued against Kant. And he argued that the husband and wife should have full emancipation of women within marriage, property rights, voting, everything. But even with that, he says, man and woman, however, together only constitute one complete human being. So that fractional complementarity became rooted in later Protestant philosophy. Included with this is Schopenhauer. He said that women are limited to childlike exercise of rationality tied to the concrete present, while man participated in a full range of rational activity. And I quote him, as a result of their weaker reasoning power, women are, as a rule, far more affected by what is present, visible, and immediately real than they are by abstract ideas, standing maxims, previous decisions, or in general by regard for what is far off in the past or still to come. So the woman is tied to the present. Hegel, same thing. Friedrich Hegel argued that woman was tied to the particular and man to the universal. If you know Hegel, we can talk more about it if you like. But Soren Kierkegaard, same thing. Women's rational capacities are in the aesthetic and religious spheres of existence, while man has the full range, including the ethical sphere. Nietzsche. He seemed to argue for a reverse sex polarity when he said that women were superior by virtue of their Dionysian inheritance of this energy, but he thought they were more associated with slave morality and herd morality. Those of you that know Nietzsche would know. So he really is what I call, the article I wrote is Nietzsche's ambivalence about women. He never really settles it. Very interesting, but doesn't. All right, so the next moment then of inspiration, in a certain way, comes with John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor. Mill really dedicated himself, both personally and intellectually, with Harriet Taylor to defending women in England in those terrible situations where the property laws were so bad. And he was a member of Parliament. He put forward the first bill for women's suffrage, for example. But he argued systematically, though, for a fractional complementarity. The two of them did. Now, they together worked on their books. But he says the following: with equality of experience and of general faculties, a woman usually sees much more than a man of what is immediately before her. Now, this sensibility to the present is the main quality on which the capacity for practice, as distinguished from theory, depends. Women's thoughts are thus as useful in giving reality to those of thinking men as men's thoughts in giving wide and large as to those of women. So again, with Mill, it's very interesting and quite complex, and there's some very positive things and some negative things. Now, after this period, you have what I call three post-Enlightenment developments that go in very different directions. By post-Enlightenment, I mean post-Descartes, basically. And I'll just summarize them very briefly, and we could go into these in more detail if you would like. This is the next page over 19th and 20th century. But because I want to spend some time really at the end on what's the new foundation for integral complementarity that's so interesting. But the first is the unisex development in Marxist philosophy that basically argue there are no significant differences between men and women, but in order to make this actually happen, private property has to be abolished. The wife should not any longer be a mere instrument of production, and so on. A lot of later Marxist feminists continue this. I give you some examples here. Selma James argues that women should get wages for housework. Marlene Dixon, they all begin to see not only poverty, but pregnancy and marriage as the enemy of women's liberation. So they're strongly pro-abortion. Marriage should only be based on preference, for short terms when you want to be with someone and so on. Schulen with Firestone is the most radical in terms of the unisex position. She argues that woman's body itself hinders her full development, emancipation. Therefore, women will only be free when all babies are born in test tubes and gestated in laboratories. Okay, her book is called The Dialectic of Sex. So that's that little direction there. Then the next one would be found in, starting with de Beauvoir, for example. Before I get to that, you do have a traditional gender polarity arguments reasserted through Freud, who argues that the male anatomy is superior to the female anatomy, if you're familiar with Freud. Lionel Tiger argues that the male hormone testosterone is superior to the female hormone estrogen. You can see it's very similar to Aristotle, but it's just slightly different. Valerie Solanas, though, argues for reverse polarity by saying the female XX chromosome is stronger than the XY chromosome. And you get what they always do is they take one biological characteristic, and that becomes the determination of which gender is superior. That's always in all polarity arguments is that way, okay? Modern or early. Now, you have in another polarity argument starts with Simone de Beauvoir, who, with Sartre, really sees the female body as inhibiting woman's emancipation and allowing the male to define woman as the other and keep her enslaved. And so little by little, actually, the other becomes the enemy, okay? And the other being the male. And by the time you get to, well, I'll read you a quote from de Beauvoir, first where it starts with the body. Woman has ovaries, a uterus. These peculiarities imprison her in her subjectivity, circumscribe her within the limits of her own nature. Okay, then she says, well, woman really has no a priori identity. The basis of existentialism is precisely that there's no human nature and thus no female nature. It's not something given. So if you're familiar with Sartre's work or de Beauvoir's, their kind of existentialism, you know that the material in the bodily world always has to be overcome by freedom in a radical way. And so it's really, in my view, a completion of the Cartesian dualism that has come out, at least in terms of gender. Now, Mary Daly, who used to teach philosophy at Boston College, if you're familiar with her, she loves de Beauvoir, and de Beauvoir was born and baptized as a Catholic, but repudiated and said she actually detests the Catholic religion by the end of her life. Daly also calls herself post-Christian and repudiates her faith. And she argues that women should only be woman-identified, rejecting all close relations with men. And this becomes then the foundation for radical feminism and for some lesbian relations, or female divinity. So that's the root of the reverse polarity that argues the female is superior to the male. In France, you have some other developments of that where they focus on language. Monica Wittig argues that gender itself has to be destroyed. Helen Sicou argues it will be up to men and women to render obsolete the former relationship and all its consequences, and to consider the launching of a brand new subject alive with defamiliarization, so get rid of the family too. It goes to the total extreme. And Michel Foucault said basically that man or any human identity will disappear like a face drawn at the sand on the edge of the sea. So it goes to the complete destruction of gender, except for political purpose. They'll argue, well, we can use it for some political purposes. Okay, now, what happens next? This is where we begin what I consider the most interesting, I'll just take 10 minutes on this and then we can talk, the most interesting development in the 20th century, which is it begins with phenomenology and personalism. The two units together. Phenomenology began, I think some of you teach this here, right? And so with Husserl and in Germany, with the impulse to look at and study systematically the phenomena of consciousness, to bracket out separate things, to find out what is it really like to be conscious of X, for example. Well, Dietrich von Hildebrand and Edith Stein were two people who were very influenced by these phenomenological movements and turned that method to look at what does it mean to be a woman, what is the experience of being a woman, what is the experience of being a man, what is the experience of being married, for example. And so they knew each other and they began to work together. They had some correspondence and dialogue on these issues. Now at the same time, but slightly later, in France, you have the beginning of what's called the personalist movement. These are lay people. All of these people were lay, non-priests, non-nuns initially, who began, they were Catholic though, and they were interested in trying to find a way to defend the Catholic faith now that the Protestant Reformation had sort of taken over so extensively the political arena. They wanted to see how they could do it. So that was their motivation. So the personalist movement began in Paris with Mounier, Gabriel Marcel, Jacques and Marisa Maritain, and Nikolai Berdyaev, and they had a little study group in Paris, and out of this came what was called the Personalist Manifesto. in which they basically redefined a person as a single unity, a single identity, not in a Cartesian soul-body dualism. That was one of the fundamental. Secondly, woman, Mounier wrote an essay very soon saying a woman is also a person, very soon developed that. So it's person and community that became their prime interest. Well, what kind of background and foundation can you give for person and community? They turned back to St. Thomas and Aristotle to see if they could find a metaphysical foundation that they could combine with phenomenology to give a solid basis for the unity of the human person, and also to argue that man or woman individually is a person completely. I mean, we're complete persons. We have the same faculties, we both have bodies, but we're different ways of being persons. So that's how they started to look at that. Von Hildebrand used the word metaphysical complementarity in one of his essays on marriage of man and woman. The Nobel Prize was won, and a little bit later than that, in the 50s, for the theory of complementarity of light as particle and wave. And it was the first time the expression complementarity was used. What it meant is, in order to understand light, you have to understand how light acts as a wave and how it acts as a particle. So by analogy, in order to understand the human person, human being, you have to understand how a woman is a human being and how a man is a human being and how they interact together. You know, so that's the sort of an underlying approach to it. Now, Edith Stein was a suffragette and a feminist, but she argued that the previous feminists had totally lost view of the unique quality of woman's identity, the uniqueness by the unisex position. And so she set herself out to look at, well, how is the form of the body, the soul of the woman's body, operates differently from man, and how is it alike? Without it being a biological determinism, doesn't mean you're controlled by your body, but it's your starting point. So in her theory, she came up with the 3 levels: male, female identity, masculine, feminine, and man, woman. And each builds on the other. So the male-female biological differentiation involves, in woman's body, preparing every month to receive new life through ovulation, whether or not a woman ever has a baby. A man's does not do this. A woman reproduces within herself. A man reproduces outside himself. So she took these experiences and realities and said, from this we can see perhaps there's a certain tendency in woman's identity and a tendency in man's identity. And so then she said the psyche, consciousness, that tendency will come up into consciousness. But because a man and woman have free will and intellect, they can choose to act in line with the tendency or against it, right? You can choose to act against it or with it. So she developed this theory in her philosophy of education that a woman should be educated in all those subjects that man naturally goes towards, like mathematics and science and so on. And a man should be educated in all those subjects that a woman naturally goes towards in order to balance out those tendencies. Because if they're not balanced out, they'll be extreme and the person will not be fulfilled in their personality. That's giving you a very quick summary of it. The other thing that she did was quite interesting. She argued against Aristotle and Thomas in a certain way by saying that the body itself cannot be the prime determiner of gender, because she believed in an eternal soul and that the soul was created by God. And she said matter cannot determine the soul. Whereas remember Aristotle had said depending on how the soul matches the body, it'll be male or female. She believed that God creates a person to be a woman or a man, and then that soul, and she went back to St. Thomas, is actually configured to a particular body that matches it. Which makes more sense for Christians and for Jews and Islamic people who would see ourselves as being, if we have a faith, a belief created by God. So that's different than the Aristotelian view that somehow the matter determines the identity. All right, what happens next then? The Maritains did quite a bit too. I'll skip all that. The next thing that happens, and this is the final step in the process, the personalists in France had connections with Poland. Meunier, Poland, as you may or may not know, looked to France for culture in those early years. And they were able to get the Personalist Manifesto secretly into Poland during World War II and run off by mimeographs in Krakow. Now, who was studying right there? But John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, was a young seminarian in the Jagiellonian, right near the Jagiellonian University. As soon as the war was over, immediately, who's invited to Krakow but Meunier to give a public lecture? I'm sure Wojtyła went. He was there in the city at the time. He then went to Rome the following fall to start his priestly doctoral graduate studies. And he lived in the Belgian college. And they speak French. The first summer he has a vacation. Where does he go? But to France to study the worker priest movement. Well, you can see the connection between personalism in France and in Poland starting. And so he goes back to Poland and he writes an article on what's going on in France. Then he gets his doctorate. He gets a doctorate in theology, one in philosophy. He goes back to Poland. He's finishing his doctorate. And who's the professor there that he works with but Roman Ingarden, who was a graduate student with Edith Stein and had corresponded closely with her and knew all her works. The Holy Father recently, in the latest book he just published about a month ago, said he had read all her writings through Ingarden, basically, which is what I'd always thought, because his view is really similar to hers. And I thought, this is really an amazing coincidence. He knew German. He wrote his thesis on a German philosopher, Scheler, phenomenologist. So he then becomes the one who, with a group of philosophers in Lublin, Poland, who became known as the Lublin Existential School or Personal School, created a metaphysical foundation for a new personalism, for this complementary theory. And so John Paul II started himself to write books on the topic. His first book was called Love and Responsibility, looking at marriage, the husband and wife relation, and he's the one in that text that talks about women's ovulation disposes her to receive new life every month. It's a disposition, but it doesn't determine her. It makes her different from man. He also says that in marriage, a wife tends to want to possess the husband and children. The husband tends to want to dominate the wife, and that these are the effects of original sin. They're not punishment, but effects. He changes the whole description of it. Instead of saying, as traditionally in theology been said, well, Eve was punished for disobeying. You know, you'll bear children in pain, and your desire will be for your husband. He says, no, this is the effect of original sin. When we see that happening, a man dominating a wife. And so, as he becomes Pope, his first series of lectures were on the husband-wife relationship in Genesis. Now, this is theology, but underneath it's all his philosophy work, you know, the philosophy of person and relation. Then what happens next is he writes an encyclical. He becomes Pope. He writes one on human work. And he says, well, there's an objective sense of work, which is technology, and there's a subjective sense of work, which is the person, the worker. And furthermore, there's a way in which we should always see the person as having priority over the labor, paying attention to the person. And so he criticizes capitalism and communism for the times when they neglect the worker and look simply at the product of the labor or profit or whatever. This sets up what he calls the personalist norm, which he says he derives from Kant, interestingly enough. But the personalist norm is always you should treat another person as an end and never as a means. Okay, that's the earlier part. Now finally, in 1989, he writes an apostolic letter on the dignity and vocation of woman, in which he argues women do this better. Women pay attention to the person better than men do. And now you'll find a lot of feminists who will talk about caring and all that. And it's interesting, but he says women often have to show men how to pay attention to the whole person. Now this doesn't mean all men are all women. He's very careful about not making generalizations, but it's a tendency. And he calls this woman's genius. This kind of shocks everybody. You know, women's genius is how, through centuries, they've paid attention to other persons. So you can look at Mother Teresa, I mean, you can look at anyone. And that becomes the way that woman expresses her genius. Furthermore, he argues, and this shocked a lot of people, that in marriage, a woman, a husband and a wife should submit equally to one another out of love for Christ. And again, it's going into theology, but it's trying to overturn a rationale for women's obedience, being in the private sphere, never being independent. And so right now, just today, there are a lot of controversies about these arguments. And some people take what they call the headship argument, that the male ought to be the head of the family. But others say, no, it's worked out. God is the head of the family. This is religiously speaking. But the woman and men equally should submit to one another. And each couple has to work it out depending on their personalities and their needs and so on. So that's another thing that he's done. Finally, I'll just skip way ahead here. We can go into this in any more detail because I'm over time. Oh, he wrote a paper for the Beijing UN National Conference on Women 10 years ago, in which he argued that men and women have an ontological complementarity. So it's a foundational, it's not just, he says it's ontological from the physical and psychological point of view, and it has a biological, individual, personal, and spiritual dimension of complementarity, 4 different ones. And again, I can elaborate what those are. The individual involves using the will and intellect. It's mainly like Nietzsche or Kierkegaard. You create yourself as an individual. But the personal is when you enter into relations with others, cooperation, and so on. And spiritual would be in your relation with God. All right, finally, the very last thing that he did, which totally stunned people in 1995, in the Gospel of Life, he says what we have to have is a new feminism, and he uses that phrase. No one could believe the Pope used this phrase. Paragraph 99 of the Gospel of Life, if you want to read it. He says we need a new feminism. Well, what is new feminism? He describes it. It has 2 things. And I quote him. It depends on women to promote a new feminism, which does not imitate models of male domination. I mean, he uses this phrase. And it achieves and fights for overcoming all discrimination, violence, and exploitation of women. So that's shared with old feminism. But there's a difference. There's one new thing it has to do. The second difference thing the new feminism has to do is tap into women's genius to be the root of being disposed to pay attention to the person in all circumstances, regardless of whether they're elderly, sick, poor, hungry, useful, ugly, whatever. It makes no difference. And he says women first learn and then teach others that human relations are authentic if they're open to accepting another person, a person who's recognized and loved because of the dignity which comes from being a person. This new feminism is the fundamental contribution which the church and humanity expect from women, and he concludes, quote, it's the indispensable prerequisite for an authentic cultural change from the culture of death. So, there we go.
Thank you very much.
So, we can talk about anything you want. I'm going to just change my glasses so I can see you better instead of reading. But anything you'd like to ask about or, argue with? Or
Do you know about Eastern religious views on man and woman?
To tell you the truth, I had to bracket that out. I mean, I know a little bit, from things, but I decided I had to simply just take the Western, and even that, I mean, this is enormous.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some.
There's a lot. They look more on the complementarity, they don't have a metaphysical foundation, but they do, some people say, have a complementary spiritually and things like that. Yin and yang and, all these different things. But it's not based in the notion of a person as a real, ontologically unique and unrepeatable being. In the West, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we all believe that the human person, somehow created in the image of God, has a unique and unrepeatable identity. We don't want to lose that personality. Even like in Judaism, Buber talks about I and thou. Whereas in East, my understanding is that part of it is to overcome all ego and all difference and just to become one with everything.
That owes to the collectivistic nature.
Right. It's a different understanding of enlightenment and perfection that we have. But, I mean, it'd be very interesting to compare the two. Yes?
I had two thoughts. One, just to see Valerie Solanas listed in here and talked about, moved me nearly to tears of happiness. Just that she was in this company, because of considering her struggles. And I only know her from a movie called Who Shot Andy Warhol.
Right, she shot him, and she was mad at him. I mean, she's not a real philosopher, but in this, she's the one to uniquely say this thing about
she was the author of the Scum Manifesto.
Right, the Society for Cutting
So the fact that,
terrible.
that she made it into this list and moved me.
Are you glad or sad?
Glad.
Glad, okay. I debated about it because, you know, sometimes people like that, they're on the periphery. But I think she was original in her thought, originally wrong, in my view. But she's part of the picture anymore.
So
Valerie Solanas, I think she's probably still alive, I don't know. She was a radical.
I think she died in a mental hospital.
Oh, did she?
But,
no, thank you for telling me that. I'm sorry. To pray for her.
Question, like along with what Chris mentioned about Eastern religions, so I was thinking how Jung and the animus part, and the idea of human development to achieve a measure of androgyny as we progress through life, and become older and whatnot, and adopt more of what males the female role and understanding, and vice versa. How does that fit in with?
That's a great question, and I'm doing a lot of thinking about this, and I haven't come to a definitive answer, but I'll tell you the parts of my thinking. It's clear that Edith Stein follows Jung's view that the fully perfect person has a combination of masculine. I'll draw something on the board because I used to think that, and now I'm moving in another direction. I'll tell you why. If you look at this, you have sort of the male and female. And this is the traditional Jungian view. You have the anatomical thing as sort of a point, right? Then if you bring in masculine, let's say up here, and you bring feminine in down here, and one of my sisters is supposed to join us sometime now, so if you see a nun walking by, she doesn't know quite where we are. You have the introduction then here of a male, a male can have masculine and feminine characteristics, is what he says, and a female can have masculine and feminine, or you can have them moving more. A female could be more feminine and not. But the really mature person for Jung and for Stein incorporates the best of both, and in that sense, you're saying it sort of becomes a kind of androgynous identity. However, there's always a different starting point. So it's not unisex androgyny, because you start as a man from a male starting point, and you start as a woman from a female starting point. Now, what you have happening with existentialism, which began a little bit later, my field that is personalism, existentialism, let's say, you have the introduction of the notion that you actually define your identity in relation to those choices you make. So you say a teenager says, well, I'm not going to be like my mother, or I'm going to be like my father, or not. Right? You make choices, and you start to create your own identity. De Beauvoir would say this too. So you have then what we would call more a three-dimensional, like a tetrahedron, a three-dimensional understanding of an interior space where you decide what kind of woman or man you're going to be. And that's how I used to think and historically, you can see in history of philosophy that it starts with this point really up into the 15th century. All you get in terms of man and woman is male, female. Then in Renaissance, you start to get notion of masculine and feminine characteristics coming in, right? Nicholas Cusa, others start talking about it. And it's not till the 19th century that you start to get this notion of creating your own identity. Now, that would be Jung's view, too, that what you do is you draw upon the great archetypes and you come up in you and you make choices and you create your own identity. In relation, you're always in relation to others and women with each other and mothers and daughters, and it's always in relation. Now, what has made me change my mind or think differently about this? When I started studying John Paul II's work, I was surprised to discover he never uses the phrase masculine with a woman or feminine with a man. He never says a feminine man or a masculine woman, or a woman can discover her masculinity or a man is femininity. Never. So I thought to myself, this is very odd. Because, in our culture we use it all the time and so on. And I had the privilege of going to Poland for a while and working with a Polish philosopher at Lublin for 3 months one summer. And I could start at the Polish language, if any of you speak Polish. I mean, they have masculine and feminine endings for words, and then for depending on whether you're talking to a woman or not. So I thought maybe he just wasn't aware of this. No way. It's clearly in the culture. So it was a decision he had made. And as I thought more and more about it, I could see that what he was doing, he basically says masculine, and there's a big variety of what masculine means, is a man's way of being in a world, and feminine is a woman's way of being in a world. That's it. So, I mean, if you're a man and you're acting as a man, you're going to be masculine, the way he looks at it. Never, never crosses over. Now, today, when we have a lot of, I would say, mixing up of what it is to even be a man or a woman, I don't know if you're aware, but for example, the head surgeon at Johns Hopkins has recently written a book called Surgical Sex, an article Surgical Sex, in which he said that at Johns Hopkins they have made the decision not to do sex change operations anymore. And they were at the forefront of this because it's not, they feel it's not he said it's actually contributing to an illness rather than helping someone. They've done longitudinal studies and so on. Now this is rather controversial, as you can imagine, but he's the head surgeon and they've all come to that conclusion. It's very interesting. It just seems to me that it may be better, and I'll tell you another reason why. If you're a man and you're called feminine, what's your response? You're normally uncomfortable with it. And if you're a woman and someone says, you're a masculine woman, you're uncomfortable with it. It's not something we like to be told, I don't think. Instead of being like St. Teresa used to say, my sisters, be manly, you know. But today we would say, be strong, be courageous. We wouldn't like it so much. So I think it may be that he's showing a way to do it. It doesn't deny what Jung is saying, that all of these archetypes become part of our identity, but maybe our way of describing it will be a little more pristine.
Yeah, there was a lot
Does that make sense to you?
Baggage that comes with those terms.
Mm-hmm.
Who was it that you just mentioned that spoke of just the masculine way of
Pope, John Paul II, Carol Wojtyła. He's the only person I've seen avoid it, but consistently. And he's written about gender. He's written about gender from 1950s on, very deep and systematically. And he's always avoided. He never said why, but I'm just wondering if that's why. I don't know why. Yes, Karen.
This Prudence thing's kind of, I bought your books after I met you, because I thought it was fascinating what you were doing, the concept of women throughout philosophy, because after being a philosophy student for the last 8 years, very rarely have I heard of other women or women philosophers. So I'm looking at your page and I was looking through your book at all these women out there that I don't hear about in school. So I was wondering, like, and I know like a lot of them probably didn't have the, you know, like Kant, like the big theories or something, but there's still, we don't hear anything of these women in philosophy classes.
Well, I think that's going to come, but little by little. And my view is always, you should only use them where they are really appropriately there. I mean, if you have a separate...
So maybe that's what I want to hear about.
No, I mean, it depends. You have to, the teachers have to know them first. I mean, you teach what you studied in graduate school, and so it's a long process. But I mean, this is helping the process. There are a lot of people that are writing, but I myself, I mean, I teach the history of philosophy at the seminary, and I don't insert things that aren't of appropriate value. But I will wherever it's appropriate. So when we study Plato, for example, I'll look at the husband-wife, what does he say, the community. When we study Aristotle, I always bring in the theory of gender because I know it, and I bring it in. I have a full lecture on each one for each philosopher we do. And I'll bring in women philosophers. Edith Stein, we study in anthropology. I teach the concept of person. But there are some little books that are coming out now that are like of modern philosophers. For example, when you study Descartes' meditations, you could read his letters to Elizabeth. She nails him on the soul-body relationship. They're wonderful little letters. Or you could, what I do is I allow people to choose if they want to do a paper on that. Some students would, some wouldn't. It gives them the chance to go in that area. But I wouldn't introduce it if just to have a woman philosopher there. Now that's just my way. I think they have to earn the right to be there by what they say. But there are a lot who have, little by little. If you teach Rousseau, then you could easily introduce Wollstonecraft, because she's really engaging with him on specific things.
And on that, I have a specific question. Did Wollstonecraft actually publish during Rousseau's life? And was there a response back? Was there a dialogue between?
There was a little. I think she was a little bit after. I think now that's a good question. I cannot remember right now the answer to that question, but I think she's a little bit after Rousseau. If you read his biography, has a very mixed up life. He was what do you call it, with Hume. Hume got found in a place. He was being driven out of every country because of his personal life choices. I won't go into them here, but he was driven out of France and out of Switzerland and then into England. And yeah, I mean, but he, in some ways he deserved it, I think, sometimes. But I mean, I'll just give you one example. He writes Emile on education, and he has a mistress. He never marries, and every child they have, he forces her to put in an orphanage against her will. I mean, that's the kind of fellow he was. Okay. Talking all about how you ought to bring up, families in this ideal situation, and then, what he did. Anyway.
On that, that actually ties into a question I have. I have one comment, and I'd like to have your reaction on it, and then I have one question. The question first is, in the entire corpus of Western philosophy that you've studied, and obviously it's immense, especially from Aristotle, that we credit as being the first logician, did anybody bring up the obvious fallacy of the might versus right argument, that, hey, here's all this, the polarity is obviously it's written by men, but these are people who happen to be in the positions of power. Did anyone just come up and say, well, hey, wait a minute, maybe we're wrong because we're speaking from positions of superiority?
Yeah, those arguments came out. They started to come out, certainly John Stuart Mill did, but they started to come out earlier. Poulain de la Barre, he did.
Which was a time? What was the time?
Well, the time frame, he's right after Descartes. Okay, that's when those questions started to get, because they were questioning tradition and culture and power and so on. But I think the deeper reality is that even if these things come out, what you see happening is the same thing going in the other direction at different times. It's part of human nature, unless you have a really strong balance that somehow men and women are of equal dignity and worth. But yet there is some significant difference. It always goes out of balance one way or another. And historical circumstances play.
Like the Aristotelian contention that a piece of wood has to be bent the exact opposite way to find.
Right, you have to hold the tension, and it's not easy sometimes. But I think what we find happening is the whole field of history didn't really start again until the 19th century. I mean, as a scientific field of research, and so in history and political science, you have people looking at that aspect of it. You can also get a reductionism there and just say, though, it's just power. But I think there are bad arguments, that's why I'm in philosophy. I think there are bad arguments that are proposed and bad, poor claims and evidence not supporting them. And so as a philosopher, that's my part, is to show the arguments, where they're weak, where they're strong. And not to, I do in these books connect it to historical circumstances like satires. Witchcraft comes in a little bit because you'll see the philosophy influencing those arguments. But I don't want to make the claim that it's just power that does it. I think it's more complex.
And my comment is that when you were sitting here talking about, earlier, when you were talking about how, and I forgot who said this, that it might have been the Pope, but that when we look at issues of femininity and we look at issues of masculinity, that we cannot describe human beings without looking through these two different registers.
we can't have a complete
Right.
understanding of what the human body
I had a little epiphany that when I see these works here, the concept of a woman, really what we're discussing is the concept of human, because finally we're being offered a complete gender complement to what is blindly masculine throughout all of the
one part, that's all. Because everybody, you know, it's just my part in this. But it does bring in,
or at least it opens
data.
that door.
It brings in the data that has been not available for people for a long time. So that's true. I hope it does help. Yes, Rod.
Yeah, I found this historical overview to be really interesting, and glad you could present it. But it made me wonder about the pernicious impact of metaphysics in general on talking about these issues. Because, I mean, even to take Plato and Aristotle as examples, with Aristotle, metaphysics prejudges what he says about men and women in a way that you don't find in Plato. So that, you know, form is always identified with men, matter with women, and so he's almost led just stepwise to denigrate women about various issues. But I was thinking of this passage from the Republic on the argument that women are different, but in no politically significant way. And there, Socrates says something very interesting, that we know people's nature by what they take to most easily. So whatever you find that you're able to engage in and learn quickly and easily, that shows your nature. Well, that suggests almost something like an empirical test of people's natures. That is, there's no metaphysics from without, which is leading the argument one way or the other. But Plato comes to really revolutionary idea about men and women based on just observing men and women, or something like that.
Yeah, that's a very good insight. But I think he goes further than just observing, though. It's true, he observes that part, because he's going to propose a theory about how they ought to be educated and ought to live from a principle of the good, of love of the good,
Yeah.
and what is best. The way it is now, half the society is not really, contributing itself. So it weakens the society. At least it seems to me that's his political argument. It weakens, and it's a good argument, I think. My approach is to say, I mean, I love metaphysics, and I think that if you jettison metaphysics altogether, it literally floats in terms of moral, what people prefer. And I've always thought, I mean, metaphysics is what I wrote my doctorates to, so I've always thought that the goal of metaphysician is to truly uncover the fundamental structures of reality that are really there. They're not made up. Aristotle got a lot of them right, some wrong. The ones he got wrong had a big effect on women's identity. But it doesn't mean we should give up metaphysics. I always say, for example, if you play a sport and you see a bad game, baseball, or you don't give up the sport just because it wasn't played well or told well. I mean, I think that's why I would say I think that there are metaphysical or foundational ontological realities that are very important and that need to be uncovered. And then, but within that also, we've learned a lot more about what women tend towards and men tend towards, because women now have opportunities that they didn't have before. So but I think that's why Stein's argument and John Paul II's is so interesting. Is it really the case that we women have this disposition towards caring about another person as a whole person? Is that related to our ovulation? I mean, it's our biological nature every single month, unless we repress it. I mean, through birth control, or we could act against our nature by abortion, for example. But that's a choice of the will, to act against our nature. But what he's saying is if you do act with your nature, you can then bring this into society as a whole and help transform it, perhaps, in a way that it needs to be transformed today, where efficiency and some of these other things, that and technology, which really is the great gift of men to culture, by and large. I mean, these great inventions are by and large things that men have done to the benefit of everybody. So it's bringing that.
And the detriment.
And the detriment, right. And the detriment. It can go, right, any of these qualities. I mean, a woman, if she's carrying, you know, a woman who gets too much involved with her children or others can smother them, right? So you have to learn from each other how to perfect your own unique personality, whatever it is. And then in your own area of activity, whether it's the home or in my case it's teaching men mainly now. They want to be priests, but in the past it was teaching men and women in a large secular university, a lot like this here. So I think that's the thing, is we have to, I think there is something to it, interestingly enough. And it doesn't mean you have to have had a baby in the case of a woman, you know, to have this. You know, it's just part of the orientation of our biological nature. But it's not a determinism in any way whatsoever. It's just interesting to think about at this point. Yes?
To try to stir up the pot a little bit.
Good.
I think I believe in gender. My life experience has suggested to me that there's something there in yin and yang, or masculine and feminine, although it seems to me very hard to filter out what's social construct and what's really there. Part of my reason for believing it, actually, though, is my experience with feminine males and masculine females. But, well, first, I'd like you to try to characterize as best you can what you think this distinction actually does amount to. What is the masculine versus the feminine? And then, what I have an even harder time understanding is just exactly what it's relevant to in moral terms. I mean, I take it that the Pope has a certain agenda, that he wants to draw certain moral conclusions about what forms of life are natural versus unnatural. But it's not at all clear to me how that's supposed to go.
Well, actually, the latter part, I'll just bracket that out, because that concerns ethics, and he does have a whole different ethical theory that doesn't derive from the gender issue. Okay. So, but to come back to what you're saying is, I think if it's useful to talk about masculine women and feminine men, then one should do it. I mean, I don't think one shouldn't do it in a way. And I think
useful.
Yeah. Well, if it's useful, I mean, if someone finds it, for example, in the traditional way, we would say, the way it's been used historically is that, like when St. Teresa of Avila says to her nuns, be manly, she means be strong, okay? Act like a man, whatever. There's nothing wrong with that. It was useful, it was understood, it was respected. What you find in those earlier days is it's only the positive of the masculine and the positive of the feminine that are appreciated. If it goes to macho or feminine, the negative, then you don't want it, right? You just want the positive. So you want to have feminine, meaning gentle or whatever in the culture would be there, but you don't want a feminine. At least that's traditional people. Or a woman doesn't want to be called macho, because it's a derogatory way of describing masculine. So what you're going to be doing then in that case, I think, is you're going to be looking at how the characteristic is supposed to be characteristic of feminine or masculine, and then applying it. So I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's fine if it's helpful, useful. And certainly, I mean, Edith Stein, Jung, argues that unless a person develops the positive characteristics of the other gender, they don't come to full maturity. At least that's what I understand in his theory of individuation. It's been a while since I've looked at it, but to become an individual, you have to develop the positive characteristics of the other gender somehow. And I think it depends, you know, it depends on your career and what you're doing, or your vocation, whether you do that or not.
Well, but again, roughly speaking, how would you characterize those different characteristics?
Well, I don't myself want to, because I don't right now today find it helpful. You see what I mean? I think I'm preferring a little bit more today just to use the adjectives without gender identity in general. You know, that is, I mean, the gentleness, or certainly intuition, reasoning. I don't like to think that when I use my reason and philosophy, I'm doing a masculine thing. I'm doing something I do as a woman as well. I'm trained, I've done it for 30, 40 years. I don't like to see it as masculine, should we?
Human thing.
Well, it's a human characteristic that I've developed and I'm using in my career as a philosopher. So I don't really want to. Now this, maybe you're also asking me though more for this other thing that the Holy Father is looking towards, which is paying attention to another person. Is that part? Because he's identifying that as woman's source of her genius. That's that's what he's saying, is a fundamental difference.
Does that go for like, do you think that sexual preference has a role in your gender, like your psyche as a gender? Like if you're a lesbian woman?
I don't know. I think it doesn't connect to identity, gender identity. It certainly has a role on how you live as a man or a woman, but not on your identity per se.
So what is gender identity outside of physical attributes?
Well, it's the way you are a man, how you are. You're a man. You're a male human being. It's not just physical attributes. It's your psyche, your lived experience of your body.
Yeah.
Okay.
So isn't sexuality covered under gender then? Like, I mean,
yeah,
it seems
sexuality
like
is part of gender.
Just like
Sexuality is part.
The public and the individual on a larger scale. You know, there's got to be some intertwining in between both of those. So it seems to me like relevant that there would be some sort of correlation between if there is like any characteristic of a man or a woman that is like fundamental to them by their nature. And it seems like that there would be some sort of correlation between like sexualities. Does that make sense?
Sexual act? When you use sexuality, I'm trying to understand.
I mean, sexuality is
sexual action or sexual identity?
I think like your sexual preference. Let's say sexual preference. First of all, like if you're trying to determine what would be a fundamental characteristic of man or woman, and the Pope said that the woman has this ability to listen, let's say. And he claims that that's a fundamental difference between a man and woman, is woman's ability to listen.
He doesn't say that though.
That's kind of what was it? She notices humans or something?
Pay attention.
No.
Pay attention. I see that.
She's
listening.
concerned about the whole person.
Right.
Listening might be a way of doing it, but.
Well, yeah, in a more poetic way of speaking, I would call it listening.
I don't know. It's okay. Let me try to sort out the core part of your question, if I can, because I think there's something very.
I'm just trying to get what determines these fundamental characteristics that gives like some sort of like distinguishment between like a man and a woman, outside of physical attributes, because you're saying that it's how you live and whatever, and I really.
If you start with this, okay, you start with this as a man, right, and you start with this as a woman.
Yeah.
Okay. Then what you have is your lived experience, or your consciousness, let's say, however you want to say that, of your body. Okay, that's what we call the psyche.
Right.
Is you're looking at the whole person.
Right.
You have the psyche. So your psyche is how you experience having a male body. It's how I experience having a female body.
So the greatest influence on our psyches are our physical attributes?
Well, it depends. I wouldn't want to make that extreme statement. You can have a trauma, you can see someone being murdered on the street, and that's going to have a much bigger impact on your psyche.
See it as a
whether
man.
the ovulation for that month if you're a woman or whatever. I mean, you see, what your psyche does a lot of things. Okay? We have, in philosophy, we talk about having these 5 interior senses, the memory, I don't know if you're familiar with the memory, estimative sense, the imagination. Your consciousness has all these. You have the 5 external senses. All of these, the data from all of these things, the common sense coordinates your sight and your touch. All these things integrate elements in your consciousness, some of which will be your lived experience of the body. If you're a male athlete, your body, your experience of what your body can do with your strength is going to be different from me, for sure. So there's all these factors that go into just your consciousness of yourself. That's before we even talk about the will and the intellect. Okay, you've got all this happening. You've got your vegetative sense, your body, all these things going on. Who you are, though, integrates in some way all these things. Then, when you have the higher powers, this is not the psyche, you also have your experience in the world, what it's like to be a man in the world, I mean, job opportunities, for example, everything like that. You have all these things that happen. Then, in addition to the experience of your body and of the world and all that, and of your memories, your family, your whole thing, you have an intellect and a will. Now, these are your higher faculties, we would say, or the higher parts of yourself, where you make decisions about yourself. And this is where, if your sexual preference, let's say, your decision about what you're going to have an attraction to a woman or a man. As a child, you'll have attraction. You'll have sexual experiences, they say. I mean, nobody says exactly how that gets established, but it seems to involve hormonal differences at the age of a certain point in generation. It involves adolescent hormonal developments. It involves experience, sexual experience, and it involves choices, too. So you have all these things together going in to what kind of a man you're going to be and what kind of a woman I'm going to be.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
to me, it seems like that the intellect and the will of the male and the female would be probably equal. This is just where I'm going on.
Yeah, the faculties, well, let's say some people are smarter than others, but the faculties are the same in men and women.
Yeah,
all these inner powers, our sight, our sense, our sight, are all similar.
Yeah,
They're
there still seems to be a difference between male and female.
right.
Now, my question is that, like, let's take, for instance, like sexual preference or something like that, where it seems to be some sort of like crossed wires or something like that, you know? Like, it seems from nature, for what, like, we could look at empirically, like, usually a man goes with a man, you know, and a man goes with a woman,
Yeah.
and a woman goes with a man.
That's
you
the
know?
way it
So I'm trying to
what we
figure
call
out,
naturally works.
well, how does it break down from the,
You
another
have
way
to
to
have a
rephrase my
psychiatrist.
question, to get to, well, philosophers are psychiatrists.
Yeah, I
to-
can't give you that answer.
Well, to get to my point, I could like ask you another question. What is it that is about like the female body, you know, that allows her to? What was the exact quote? Since listening is not appropriate.
But paying attention to the other person.
Pay attention to the
Okay,
other person.
okay.
So I mean, like, because you're saying like, you know, all these things come out of my lived experiences as a male.
Right,
or
I'll give you
whatever.
an example that they talk about here. Okay, just take a husband and wife and there's a baby being born. They're pregnant, the wife goes through the pregnancy. What happened here? Somebody's sitting on the table, I can't get this chair out. Oh, there we go. Okay. A woman is pregnant for 9 months. After a certain number of months, she begins to feel the movement of her child, and she has a different relationship with this human being growing within her than the father. I mean, the father's outside the process. He can feel the child, he can look at pictures, he's outside the process. So, one of the things that John Paul II suggests is, and this makes a lot of sense to me, is that a man has to make a choice